Hey, it's Jim, and this is level 1 of the CFA program, the topic on economics and the learning module on international trade. One of the first sentences inside of this learning module suggests that it's important for analysts to understand international trade and global supply and demand to be able to more accurately compute a return on investment. This is the Institute's way of emphasizing to us that all topics, including international trade, have their place inside of the policy statement. Now, when we get to level 2 and especially level 3, this international trade concept is going to be totally relevant for what inputs that we place inside of that policy statement. But for now, here in level 1, this seems to be the focus of just on the economics. So I thought I'd give you one of my silly examples to begin this recording. I grew up very close to one of the great rivers in the United States. And of course, we would travel across the river back and forth. And when you traveled, especially in the summertime, across the river east, it always smelled. And I would say to my dad, what is that smell? And my dad would say, well, son, that's these farmers over here growing mushrooms, and they need extra manure, and the mushrooms, they stink. And I was like, well, why don't we grow those over on our side of the river? And it was because of the soil. And my dad, who, by the way, was a fantastic gardener, he explained the difference between the soil types on that side of the river and on this side of the river. And he would say something like, we let them make their mushrooms over there. And on our side of the river, we grow corn and tomatoes and we trade. And that's pretty much the basis for international trade, even though it was just on one side of the river. But you see, we have specialization over there and we have specialization over here. They benefit over there. We benefit over here. And so these learning outcome statements are exactly an application, an application of my dad's lesson, 40 some years ago. So look at these benefits and costs of international trade. Look at the third one there, benefits and motivations and advantages for these kinds of arrangements between and among countries that promote international trade. And then somewhere in the middle, we're going to talk about trade restrictions. So let's go ahead and start with the benefits of international trade. Boy, I've already mentioned these just quickly in my silly example. Countries gain from specialization. So instead of one side of the river and the other side of the river, let's take the obvious example. Here we have the United States and Canada above us. So what happens is that there is a scenario under which the Canadians, they do something up there. And what's the big export in Canada? Energy, obviously, and lumber, obviously, and probably some other stuff. And so they export tons and tons of that to the United States. What do we ship back up there? Well, we refine their energy and we send it back, and we send all sorts of stuff up there. So, of course, what happens then is that we can receive high prices for exporting and possibly lower prices for importing. Now, those probably don't have a one-to-one relationship, but there's that net gain for the country. Do you remember in another learning module, we talked about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And so there's the net gain for each country. Now, if we're shipping more that way and we're importing more this way, then that means that we're probably going to have an increase in our gross domestic product. It's probably going to be an inflation adjusted, let's call it real GDP. And that leads directly into the next benefit is this efficient resource allocation. One of the first things that I learned when I was in my master's program, I don't remember learning this as an undergraduate, but maybe that's because I was a lunkhead as an undergraduate. But I remember one of my finance professors saying, that resources ought to flow to their most efficient outcome. And I remember thinking, that makes a lot of sense. And does it happen? And of course, it happens here because of international trade. So think about my example of mushrooms and corn. There have to be certain resources that flow to the planting and harvesting of mushrooms that are different to the planting and harvesting of corn and tomatoes. And so those resources flow there, those resources flow here, same thing up to Canada, same thing down to the United States. So that means then that exporting companies in both countries are probably going to become larger, which means they'll have the advantages of economies of scale. And then this brings in the final specter, and this is where we have some issues that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, increases in competition. Now, of course, increases of competition, this sounds like a great thing, but there are some disadvantages to that, and we'll talk about that here in this slide, because the obvious notion is that it can hurt domestic employment. Those of you who paid any attention to the U.S. president from 2016 to 2020, Donald Trump was very, very big on, hey, pro-USA worker. We're going to go ahead and impose costs on any foreign employer who comes in to try to take away jobs from U.S. workers. So there's no doubt that this can hurt domestic employment. What that means then is that these firms here in the United States, let's say, they may be able to generate less profitability. And so workers are going to be furloughed, workers are going to be laid off, workers are going to be displaced. Now, what that also does, and this, let me go back here quickly, this tools right into that increased competition down there at the bottom. And so we're going to have to compete with those importing countries. Well, what that means then is that we're going to have the government to step in and say something like, all right, these things here, these are hurting our domestic economy. So we're going to go ahead and take action to resolve those kind of issues and help those issues. So here's just a definitional slide. So a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Export subsidies, this is a scenario under which the government says, you know what, you make whatever it is you make and you ship to Canada, we'll pay you $10 every time you make something and ship it up there. So an export subsidy. An import quota, instead of an actual tax, we'll say something like, you know what, and we did this back in the 1980s with Japanese automobiles. We said, you can only bring in 10 a day, when the demand in the United States might have been for 12 or 14 a day. So those import quotas. Voluntary export restraint, these are just restrictions that are probably voluntary. I would imagine the Institute would explicitly say they're voluntary. In practice, there's some nudging, maybe some pushing, maybe some other kinds of motivations to get those restrictions in place. Now, sometimes we have a scenario under which, it takes us, let's say, 8 steps in order to make some finished good. So we have step 1 and 2 and 3 all the way out to 8. So every time that we do something, we add value to it. But sometimes when we're adding the value, we don't add the value here. We ship it up there and they add the value and then they ship it back. And so one of these domestic content provisions prevents us from going ahead and shipping it up there to Canada, let's say, and then having them ship back here. We say, we have to do all those steps in line. Embargoes, these are extreme examples. Of course, the one that pops into my mind and ought to pop into your mind is the U.S. embargo with Cuba. That's been going on for a long time. And then, of course, it's difficult to have this conversation without saying something about a central bank or the Fed here in the United States, is that it can say something like, oh, you know what? You need to make sure that you don't send any of your capital up to Canada. So these would be capital restrictions. All right, I want you to get your phone out and take a picture of this slide. And this slide, this is one slide here. So as you're taking that picture, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my father and give you an example. So let's suppose that my dad is a great farmer and he harvests 10 cucumbers a day, and he takes them out to our front yard, puts them by the mailbox, sets up a sign that says cucumbers $1. Now let's suppose that he can sell 10 of those every day. He harvests 10 a day, he puts them out there, and he sells 10 for $1. So he makes $10 every day, right? And let's just suppose he does this over a week's period. So 7 days, he makes $70. At the end of that week's time period, he goes and buys himself a case of Budweiser, gives some of it to my sisters and me, takes my mother out to dinner, and he's happy. Supply equals demand, right? But then let's suppose that our neighbor across the street is also interested in my dad's cucumbers, but he says something like, you know what, I have a sister who visits me every week from Canada, and she has a farm up there, and she has these wonderful cucumbers. So every week she comes and she brings me 70 cucumbers. Now let's not worry about air conditioning or freezing or any of that stuff. Let's just suppose they're fresh. So my dad's neighbor, he puts 10 out every day, and maybe he'll charge that same dollar. Maybe he'll charge $1.10. Maybe he'll charge 90 cents. And he'll advertise Canadian cucumbers. You know, they were irrigated from the water from Santa Claus and the North Pole. These are beautiful cucumbers. So he has maybe a little bit of a marketing advantage over my dad. Maybe he'll try to sell them for $1.10 to recover some of the costs of transportation. Maybe he'll charge 90 to try to undercut my dad. So whatever that means. Now, if my neighbor can sell 10 a day and my dad can sell 10 a day, well, my dad's probably still happy, right? He's still getting his $70 at the end of the week. And my dad was a wonderful neighbor. And so they high-five each other and they say, isn't this great? However, what happens when this competition starts eating into my dad's profitability? You know, suppose that my neighbor one Monday morning puts out 15 of these things, sells them for 90 cents. My dad has 10 out and can sell them for $1. And oh my gosh, my dad only sells 2 or 3 of them. All right, so this goes on. And at the end of a couple of weeks, my dad's like, oh my gosh, I can't buy Budweiser anymore. My wife, we can't go out to dinner. So my dad picks up the phone and calls Washington, D.C. and say, this is unfair. This is unfair. Do something about it. And so the government says, all right, let's go ahead and let's put a tariff on these cucumbers that come from Canada. And let's just say that the tariff is 50 cents. All right, so now my neighbor puts the Canadian cucumbers out there and they sell for, let's say, $1.40 or $1.50. And my dad is now selling for $1. Now think about what my dad is observing during this. My neighbor's still selling some because, right, Canadian cucumbers, Santa Claus, and all that kind of good stuff. But every time my dad's neighbor sells a cucumber, my dad misses out on that sale. Now, if the neighbor sells 10 a week and my dad sells 10 a week, it's probably okay. My dad's probably pretty satisfied. But once that neighbor starts eating into it, my dad is going to start thinking about, wait a minute, why is that guy able to sell at $1.40? I'm going to raise my price. And that's exactly what happens here, that there is an increase in the domestic price. So my dad's going to, especially if my neighbor is selling all 10 of his for $1.40 or $1.50, my dad's saying, why am I selling my 10 for $1? So my dad's going to raise the price. So what happens to the price of cucumbers? They used to be $1 when it was just my dad. Then when there was friendly competition, it was still around $1. But now with this tariff, the price is $1. Well, maybe my dad will charge $1.35 and my dad's neighbor will charge $1.40. All right, so let's go through this column here about the impact on these tariffs. I want you to think about all this on the exam about cucumbers and my dad. So this producer surplus, this is going to increase. There's no doubt about it. Remember the definition of a producer surplus. It's nothing more than the market price minus the producer's minimum acceptable price. I mean, my dad's minimum acceptable price might be, I don't know, 30 cents or 40 cents. But when the price goes from $1 up to $1.40, then that producer surplus, that increases. But then the opposite happens with the consumer surplus. Remember, that consumer surplus equation is the price that the consumers are willing to pay for the product minus that market price. So, what might people pay for my dad's cucumbers? Maybe they would be willing to pay $1.60 or $2 or whatever it is, because after all, right, they're really good cucumbers. So that consumer surplus has to increase because the price increases, and that's what I explained just a few moments ago. So because the price increases, then that domestic consumption decreases, domestic production increases, because my dad is now saying, hey, you know what, I can sell these at $1.40 or $1.35. I'm going to go ahead and plant more. I'm going to go ahead and make more. So then what about government revenue? Of course, they get the extra tax money. And then this national welfare here, this is really important. And notice that we have bolded and redded a word in here. So national welfare, it decreases in small countries because of all of these things here on that column. But in large countries, there might be an increase in national welfare. And I'm going to go ahead and just editorialize here for just a second, if I may. It's probably not going to, national welfare is probably not going to increase even in larger countries. We've seen that with the George Bush tariffs on steel, the Donald Trump tariffs on steel, and tons of other things, the Joe Biden tariffs. We see this regularly. But let me go ahead and explain what the Institute is trying to get to you in this reading. So what happens? We have this increase in price. So that's a negative impact on national welfare. However, the government does increase its revenue. So the idea is that if the government can increase its revenue more than the price increase, then there's the might increase in the large country. And there are probably some other factors that go into this explanation. Now, the good news for you guys is that if you look at all of these, the import quotas, the export, the VER, if you look at all, they're all the same, right? So notice that what you need to concern yourself with is a couple of differences here. So look about that trade down at the bottom. So the exports decrease under an export subsidy, and no change over government revenue in the voluntary. So remember that these are almost all the same. Remember just the differences, and that should help you answer some good questions at the end on the exam. All right, how about these agreements between and among countries? Let me go ahead and skip along here just quick. We're going to get to the motivations here in just a second. We're going to get to the advantages and the disadvantages here. And so I don't imagine the Institute would go ahead and ask you questions about the types of trading blocks. You probably know this from regular reading of the Wall Street Journal. There are free trade areas. There are customs union. There are common markets. There are economic unions. And so these really are just agreements between and among countries to say something like, here, you see all these things? We're not going to do this between and among all of our countries. And so they have different names, but they essentially do the same thing. I would go ahead and just, memorize maybe a little bit of those subtle differences between and among these. But I think the great questions are, what are the motivations here? Getting into new markets. So that makes a whole lot of sense. Acquiring knowledge in the CFA readings. In the future readings, we're going to call this acquiring knowledge. We're going to call it an embedded option in our capital budgeting process. In the academic world, we call this a latent asset. So I'm going to give you an example back to my dad. Let's suppose that my dad, he buys one of these Canadian cucumbers and he puts it in a salad with tomatoes, and he said, man, this is really good. Maybe it's better than mine. I'm going to go to Canada and see what's going on up there. So he goes up there and he buys a farm and he watches the Canadian farmers and he sees that they do this and they do that. And, and so he brings that knowledge back and he's able to more efficiently manage his garden in the backyard. So acquiring knowledge, you might not know what that knowledge is. That's why we call it a latent asset in the academic world. Sharing of resources, of course, if you have these countries who are saying, you know what, we're not going to charge you a tariff or an import quota or anything. And by the way, this is how we do it. You guys could do it the same way. So strategic alliances reduces future competition because my father's neighbor and my father, sooner or later, they're going to become friends again if they form one of these free trade areas. And by the way, my dad's neighbor across the street, he's the greatest dude. Gaining competitive advantage, that links back to getting into the new markets and suppressing the trade barriers. That makes sense. All right, so what are some advantages here? And by the way, I think the Institute really does a great job of crafting these LOSs, but I'm not quite sure exactly what the semantic difference is between, motivating is to gain some of these advantages. I mean, I get it. One is before and one is after, but I kind of view these as almost similar. And I think on the exam, if you can memorize, these kinds of things here, then the following advantages are obvious, so comparative advantage, I mentioned that earlier, reduction in monopoly power, economies of scale, learning by doing, that's what I was saying about my dad, technology transfer, knowledge spillovers, so that's a latent asset there, greater foreign investment, right, when you have more capital, what did I say earlier? Capital ought to flow to its most efficient output. Higher interdependence among members. This is one of the criticisms of both the Trump administration and the Biden administration is their failure to go ahead and become a part of these different kinds of regional trading blocs or trading unions or common markets. And there's a little bit of a consensus that the U.S. economy is suffering because of that. Now, there's no doubt that there are disadvantages. So I think a good exam question would be something like, hey, here's one of these, right? A common market. Well, why do we do this? What's the advantage? And then what are some disadvantages? Clearly, the domestic employment is going to suffer, particularly to low-skilled workers and long-term employment losses, right? I mean, these things, when these jobs go over there somewhere, they're probably not coming back. We hear this all the time from politicians. We want to bring back manufacturing to the United States, but those are, relatively permanent. I'm not sure if that's a word. Adjustment costs, this is an issue thing that once we begin this process, and this happened with NAFTA back in, when was this, 1994, Canada, United States, and Mexico. And it wasn't a smooth transition. And there were all different sorts of problems that arose that nobody really anticipated, or if they did, they didn't really completely inform the investing public about all those things. So you have, inefficient firms shut down, temporary unemployment. So notice these disadvantages, they almost all relate to domestic employment. Yeah, this last one here, can create power imbalances and challenges to decision making. Yeah, that's probably a standard academic answer, and the application of that might be a little bit more subtle. So that takes us through these three LOSs. I think we covered almost everything that was in the learning module. So I want you to go and look at the 8 questions at the end of this module. Give yourself, probably less than 8 minutes, say 6 minutes to do this. I think you'll find those questions after listening to me should be okay. So hey, thanks for watching. Have a great day and good luck studying.